see what we can do here.
And I will also start it streaming to Facebook, which will take us a minute.
Okay. So I will get my ability to scribble on slides here with a red pen. It's such an honor to be here, and it's such a pleasure to see so many of you. The quality of this community, the ability to see you and to learn from you, just big smile on, So here we're going to go. My video is spotlighted, apparently. Thanks to the IGS, to the good folks doing this, to the officers. I put Gwen in there for the officers as the IGS. Big hat tip to Tavi. She puts so much effort into this, and it's such a good thing for the community. So, and CBE. So yes, thank you, Tavi. This is wonderful. I'm going to show you a lot of field work that I did not do. It's a while since I've done field work. These are some of the people who did the field work, and so I'll be highlighting some of what they've done here as we go forward, but just recognize that I'm selling their stuff. Some of it was published in this paper, and there's a cast of essential people who did the work and make this happen. And those are Nick Holshoe there, Doug McHale, hi Doug, Byron Perzak and Luke Zoot, Kaya Riverman, Atsumoto, Chris Jansen, Lizzie, Sridhar, Nate Stevens. So we'll hit some of their stuff there. Okay. Oversimplifying a lot, and I don't want to get anyone mad, but we'll start here. There's a whole bunch of models that do not assimilate a lot of deep time paleoclimate data. They don't necessarily include grounded cliff calving. And in them, Thwaites Glacier is still somewhat worrisome. There's one model that I helped with the tiniest little bit that is assimilating deep time paleoclimate and that put in grounded cliff calving in part to do a better job of matching the deep time and because of the physics. And that one makes Thwaites really worrisome. Okay, so there's a whole lot of work to do on Thwaites. And I think Ted Scambo's popped in there. I've got Ted's picture down at the bottom and David Vaughn. The International Thwaites Glacier collaboration is among the efforts that are trying to make sense about the future of West Antarctica and in particular the future of Thwaites Glacier. And thanks to NERC and the NSF and to the collaborating nations and so on, this is a fantastic undertaking. It's just fantastic. So here's two pictures of Thwaites. On the right is your bed map 2 with a very cartoony version of the flow going into Thwaites out of the deep interior basins. On the left is the analogy. The truth is neither one of these gets the true situation. We'd need a vertical merge as well. So if we had another deck or two with cars funneling in from above, that would be a better picture of Thwaites. Because what you have is, regardless of your favorite model, Thwaites ends in a bottleneck. It narrows strongly horizontally. It narrows strongly vertically. It's going out through a relatively small bottleneck. That's what it is. Because the cross-sectional area is small, it can't discharge that much ice that fast. This was an argument made fairly strongly in the AR5 and the SROC by the IPCC, that as long as Thwaites doesn't retreat a lot, we won't get a strong sea level rise out of it because the velocities needed to raise sea level a lot in a hurry through that 500 meter thick, 100 kilometer wide front are just not velocities that you can observe. If the ice retreats, you can end up with a calving front that is a few times wider. You can end up with one that is a few times taller, and a few times a few gives you an order of magnitude and a half or something like that. You do not need high velocities to get a lot of sea level rise if Thwaites retreats a lot. And so whether there is retreat is really critical in our story. Okay. So will there be retreat? right? So I guess simplifying again, that depends on the forcing. It depends on the coastal response to the forcing, and it depends on the inland response to the coastal changings. The forcing, you know, ice shelves love the waters that are rejected by sea ice growth. Ice shelves love the coldest water in the world ocean. And that means if you change anything, it's either neutral or it's bad. And that's, you know, this is the thing. You change the winds, you change the currents. It doesn't much matter. You're either bringing in water that's similar temperature, you're bringing in water that's warmer. And that's probably the biggest forcing. Clearly, you can warm the water masses, and then if it gets too warm, you get meltwater in the cracks, and that matters. That certainly must include the variability. Ensemble means missed when the warmth first arrives. Coastal response, this is changes in the ice shelves, changes in the grounding zone, estuaries, and where the water is interacting at the edge. So far, the sort of international Thwaites Glacier collaboration work has been, of necessity, has been a little bit of paleo and a lot of what's going on at the edge. What are the water masses doing? What is the ice shelf doing? What is the grounding zone doing? Because that's what you can get to. Okay. The science coming out is just fantastic. It's just blow you away amazing. You know, I'm just sitting there with this big grin on. It's worrisome, but it's just fantastic. What I'm going to talk about here is stuff that the fieldwork hasn't started yet because of COVID issues, let's be honest. And so I'm going to look at the inland response. This includes, but is not limited to, the group in the ITGC that I'm a little part of, which is GHOST. So that gave me my title, right? So oversimplifying a lot, the inland response depends a little bit on changes in the ice, especially in shear margins, but it mostly is controlled at the bed. And I am guilty. I'm coming up on having authored or co-authored 100 papers on the glacier bed. And so I'm going to reduce virtually all of that to this. The basal velocity increases as a power of the basal shear stress. And we sort of see two regimes beneath glaciers. The small power, say 1 to 3, that you get on a hard bed below any Ekin limit. And I'm just going to call that viscous, even though 3 isn't really viscous. Or the soft bed, deforming tills, which you might get the power as low as 8, but it's probably higher than that. And so you either have sort of a plastic bed, which I'll call that, or you have a viscous bed, and the responses are really different. So Byron put together, back in 2013, a group of us are involved, but Byron did the heavy lifting on this. And he asked, if we force from the coast and we play with different versions of the estuary, and there's Hugh from his Estuaries Beneath Ice Shelves paper, and we play with different versions of the estuaries, how does Thwaites respond? And it's just a flow line. And the key thing I want to highlight here is that what he found is if the bed is viscous, when you remove or thin the ice shelf, when you remove the back stress, when you melt in the estuary, you thin near the coast. And with a viscous bed, you can thin near the coast. That floats the ice off the stabilizing sill, that retreats into the deep interior basin, gets out of the bottleneck. That allows really rapid sea level rise to happen. If you have a plastic bed, you can't thin near the coast. It just propagates the signal inland because you can't raise the shear stress. And what that does is delays the retreat from the stabilizing sill in the bottleneck. If you do forced to retreat. Then it goes really fast because you've thinned the ice inlet. Emily Schwann's working with us, is looking at some of this and is making interesting progress on it. But so what this says there, now I'm going to show you in a little bit that Sridhar's field work and a whole lot of stuff that comes back, leaning on papers by Atsu, 2 of them, and by Lizzie, another one, indicates that the bed is neither viscous nor plastic, it's alternating. And that it is correlated in its alternations to the topography. Now, Byron was working with a student named Stephen Kolner, who's down here. Stephen was an undergrad then. He's off doing good things in the real world now. And he took the real simple flow line model and did some really nice things with it. And he asked, how does an alternating bed draped over topography compare to a viscous or a plastic bed? And the answer is a little disconcerting. Sometimes the mixed bed falls nicely between the end members. And sometimes the mixed bed falls outside of an end member. And what that says, unfortunately, is we have to do it right. We can't oversimplify. I stuck in a note from Ian Jock, and Ian will point out quickly, if the soft stuff is really, really, really soft, it doesn't matter what law you use if it's 0. And so then it won't matter. And I'm not sure we know the answer to that yet. But I'm going to work with sort of Stephen's result, working with Byron, that it's viscous plastic has to be done right. Okay. So let's go back, bed map 2, this triumph of getting data, and the deep trenches back in here. We're looking at the West Antarctic Rift system. This is one rift flank over here, the good one on the Transantarctics, and then there's this ratty one over on this side. And so there's the West Antarctic Rift system. And this is, if you're in the US, that's sort of the Sierra Nevada, and this is over at the Wasatch or something. And this one's a really good one, and this one's sort of ratty. Charlie Bentley discovered the deep basins in the IGY. Really, people have been worried about it since then. He sort of started the worries, and we've been worried about this pretty much ever since, Charlie. The rift spread as indicated here, and that means that the structures go like that. And what happens is that the ice wants to flow along the structures. That's what ice likes to do when it can. But it's a really long distance to get out along that one. And going out this way, it gets sort of ratty on the ends. It didn't quite break through. And so for the ice to flow along the structures, it has to build up in the middle to give it enough head to go that far. And when it does, it leaks out the side through this gap. And so Thwaites probably has more flow across topography than any other comparable glacier. Glaciers always flow over some bumps, they always flow over some topography, but it's really prominent at Thwaites because of this business that it's leaking out the side of the rift. Okay. So we're going to zoom in to, in here. And here you are, we're in this location. And Sridhar got in there in the field with the creases work a long time ago and did these 2 little, they're huge, but they're still little, these 2 little spots in there. And I'm going to show you the data that they collected from those 2 little spots. Okay. And aside, hi, Ellen. This is me back behind where Ellen's office used to be. I started working with Ian Willens in 1977, and one of the things I was doing was working on the NSF SPRI TUD radar data. And I was making maps of the bed and the internal layers out of bird, including some of them that lapped over into the Thwaites drainage. In that time, the NSF Sprite 2D radar was fantastic. And if you haven't seen what Dusty Schrader has done with digitizing it, go look. It's really still important. But the bed of the glacier was just a line. And then I made maps of lots of lines that I drew on, okay? And it was an amazing thing. This is what radar has turned into. And this is the bed of the glacier. And if this doesn't blow you away, you're not paying attention, okay? This paper was Nicole Schuch and Chris Jansen, Sridhar, and a huge shout out to John Payton and the folks at Croesus, University of Kansas. This is, SAR processing a long flight and multiple antennas hanging under the wing of the plane, and the ability to tell whether a reflection hits one wing or the other one first. And a shout out to Prasad for Croesus, this is Croesus stuff. And so you get this picture of the bed. And there's the 5 kilometer bar up there, and the topography, the dark blues are way down and the lights are shallow, and the topography in this picture is 700 meters. And these flutes are 15K long or longer, and they're 100 meters high or higher. And so we're going to talk, this is probably a fault, and this is probably another fault. Atsu is working on that. We're going to talk about these bumps and these tails. And we're also going to talk about these big moats that are carved around the upstream side of these things. So, you see them here. So those are the things we're going to especially look at. But this is what's really there. And I can tell you, if you go back, that I would not have drawn that picture based on what I could see on those data. Okay, so this is the downstream grid from Lizzie's paper. It turned into this in Holschuh et al. And again, you'll notice there's sort of this thing carved down here. Low is blue, and there's a moat carved along here, and there's tails hanging off of these things. And so that's what we're after, is the bed of the glacier. Okay. Total relief in the up glacier grid, about 700 meters, down glacier, about 500. The lee side bed forms are 100 meter or more amplitude. They're 15K long, and you can sort of see them sneaking across the next highland and being much longer. The local drops into those moats are 50 meters. These are serious. The rise out of them onto the highlands, 200 to 300 meters, okay? They are spectacular. Ice velocity in the upstream grid's 150 meters a year, right? There's nothing special about this place, except that the ice has been there for 100,000 years or more, okay? And it's flowing across a lot of bumps, right? Now, this is a slightly different view of the same data from the upstream grid, and draped on here is the seismic surveys. Seismics are a lot harder than radar, but they're really important. And this is from Atsu's work. And what's on here, they can do, Sridhar and Atsu and Lizzie and company can do, the acoustic impedance of the bed. And that can tell them, is the bed hard, like rock, or is it soft, deforming till? And light colors are soft, like that, and dark colors are hard, like that. So when the ice is flowing up onto the bump, it's hard, and when it flows into the lee, it's soft. And when it flows up onto the bump, it's hard, and into the lee, it's softer. Hard when it's going onto the bump, soft when it goes into the lee. Sort of soft in most of the basin. I'm going to show you this cross line here. So that's the cross line. And on the top here, this is the bed of the glacier, and I'll draw it in for you in a minute. And this is the hard or the soft at the bottom. And so here's the bed. Up is soft. Down is hard. And so what do you see? This is not perfect, but down is hard, up is soft, down is hard, up is soft. And like I say, it's not perfect, but this tends to work. And if you think about groundwater flow, this is going to make you say, wait a minute, he's got to have that backwards. So we're going to come back to this. But the tops are soft. Okay. This is the downstream grid. This is from Lizzie Klein's paper. She switched colors on you. Black is hard and white is soft and blue would be little pockets of water. But what do you see down in the moat is bedrock sticking out. Maybe a little soft right in the lip. But then you go up and it's hard, and then you get on a little low spot and it's soft, and then you go up and it's hard again. You go into the lee and there's either water or soft there. It's the same picture. Okay? So what you can do with this power of the seismics draped over the radar, you need them both really. The big basins, the lee side areas are soft. They have a low acoustic impedance, a low basal shear stress where that's resolvable. The up glacier facing areas are hard. Lizzie might have actually found some granite or something in one spot. Otherwise, hard. I mean, these are Miocene diatomites and things like that. They're not real rocks. They wouldn't go bing if you hit them with a rock hammer, but they're rock. They're not mud. You wouldn't sink into them. Okay. There might actually be a little bit of lee side seismically thick water. And then the moat bottoms are hard, maybe just a little bit of soft hiding over a lip, something like that. And the crests of the bed forms are softer than the troughs. That's the data set. And that's eventually what the models are going to have to resolve. Whereas the drag, well, it's on the up glacier facing things and it's in those troughs. Okay. We can come back to this if this really bothers you, but every measurement we have into a soft bed that could determine whether it's deforming has found that it's deforming. The soft beds are deforming till. The hard beds are bedrock, which is, like I say, your rock hammer would probably go thud rather than bing, but it's rock. There's a distributed water system on the soft stuff. Everywhere that we have data, that's what's there. And its pressure is very close to the overburden. If you go to Slavek's old work or something like that, Davies' work and Gary Clark's work, and it's really close. And we know that from the acoustic impedance being so low. Okay, this is not made up, this is real. Now, let's think about flow across a more or less horizontal soft surface, one of the big basins, and against a bump. The first serious solution that I know of was made by Stokes in 1851. I stuck in the baronet's picture there. He was worried about viscous drag of air on a clock pendulum. That's what Stokes, he wasn't doing sedimentation for us, he was doing that. But his solution, A, it's beautifully analytic, so you can use it easily. And secondly, every subsequent treatment gets the same basic form, which is that you have to have a high pressure on the upstream side to drive the divergence to get around the form drag of the bump. This high pressure extends to the sides. There's a coupled low pressure in the lee. The distance over which you perturb it scales with the bump size in some appropriate measure. It also scales with the velocity, and it depends on the viscosity. And you know how this has gone into glaciology. I put Weirtman and Cam and Nye and Labutri down here at the bottom. Lots of people have done lots of things with cubic obstacles and free slips and no slips and Fourier beds and everything else, but you always end up with the same basic thing. For the ice to get around a bump, it has to generate a high pressure, which extends to the sides as well as up glacier to drive the divergence over a distance that scales with the bump size and depends on viscosity and velocity. Okay. So Doug got me going on some of this. He did this beautiful paper on Weirtman, and he simulated flow over Weirtman's cubes and fought with the singularities at the sharp corners. For our paper, he and also Luke Zoot did some work on this. It did some 2D versions. So there's Doug and there's Luke. And this may be more fitting for some of our topography, and it's also easier. And you can always go find Doug's 3D ones if you prefer. And so what he's showing here is his version of Stokes, except with ice and bumps and scaling and everything else. And up here you have the reds up here is high pressure and the blue is low pressure. And then down below is, if he holds the interface at the melting point, what is the temperature of the melting point? And I'll put these in here. And what you see is on up glacier, there's a high pressure, and that gives a low temperature. And then there's a low pressure that gives a high temperature. I want you to notice that this is sort of the classic Weirtman heat convergence there to drive regulation. If it's a little bump, and heat convergence, it doesn't do much of anything if it's a big bump. But I want you to notice that there's also a lot of convergence there. And this is strictly an aside, goes back to Bernard Halley, who asked, if that bump were an abrading clast, what would the load be of the clast pushing down on the bed? And that, if this makes a cavity, which it might, this melting will drive downward motion, which would shove the clast into the bed and make a high pressure that would make it abrade. So it's conceivable that some of Bernard's abrasion is linked to this heat convergence that goes up there. Okay, that's an aside. Let's go back to the bump. We're now looking down. So this is the map. The bump is in the middle, and this is a 100-meter radius bump. It's a hemisphere. So there's a 100-meter hemisphere bump in the middle there. And this is looking at the bed of an idealized Thwaites. And what we've put on here is the water pressure, the water potential, kilopascals here. There's a weak gradient driving flow of the water from upstream to downstream that's actually a little steeper than the average on Thwaites. And then the perturbations caused by flow against the bump are illustrated by the colors down here. And what you'll notice is that, and then Byron did this, and he also put in directions of flow lines going down the hydrologic potential gradient. What you'll notice, this is the obstacle. These are saddle points. Water coming from up glacier can't get anywhere near the bump because the perturbation to the pressure at the interface caused by the bump is large compared to the perturbation caused by gradients in the surface slope. Okay, so the water can't get anywhere close to the bump. It stays outside of these saddle points as you go there, and there's some local closed flow system in here. It also can't get to the lee initially, even though it wants to. The water is routed well around. Now, what might that do? Okay. Deforming tills, I got interested in them a long time ago. Many of you are interested in them. You know that if you take all the water out of the till, the ice sits down hard, it gets lodged, it doesn't deform, it's just sedimentary rock. Right? If you put lots and lots of water in the till until it floats, the till doesn't deform because it's floating. And so there must be something that as you go from no water to some water to a lot of water, you increase deformation and then you decrease it again as you float off. Okay. My reading of work by Tavy and Gary Clark, of work by Roger Hook and company on Store, of work by Barclay and Herman and Slavek over on the Saipal coast. My reading is whenever you have a soft till, a low acoustic impedance, you're in the zone where adding water decreases deformation or subtracting water increases deformation of the till. Okay, so what you have there is that on soft beds, more water is less till flux or less water is more till flux. That's important, all right? So imagine for a moment that Thwaites had never been there. There was no ice sheet, or Thwaites went away and came back after some marine sedimentation. There are big basins out there that are covered with marine sediment. There are bumps sticking up and the ice starts flowing over it. What happens? The ice flows against the bumps. That generates a high ice pressure that extends along the bed up glacier of the bump. That excludes subglacial water up glacier of the bump, which couples the ice into the sediment, which allows the sediment to be transported away, which allows the ice to get to the rock. And till is just the lubricant that prevents erosion. So if you sweep the till away, you can now erode the rock on the up glacier side and extending along the bed above the bump. Okay, over a distance that scales with the bump size. And so what are you going to do? You're going to take this, you're going to couple over here, and now this is a 100-meter bump, remember. You're going to couple over there, and you're going to erode because you're now getting to it with the ice as well as eroding here. And I'll just compare the solutions that Doug came up with for the case with a moat and without a moat. This may be interesting. If you erode the moat deep enough and long enough, it could start capturing the water because you start to get a low pressure zone there that could bring some of the water in and then send it around the bump rather than forcing it far to the sides. So this ability of the moat almost has to erode. Once it erodes, it's going to affect the water routing. It's going to affect a lot of things. Okay. So I think moat erosion is essentially unavoidable. If any of you remember John Shaw, you don't need floods, okay? It's probably strongly evolving topography. It's strongly evolving resistance to flow. It's strongly evolving water routing. I suspect, without proof yet, that the ice is more stable early because the water is driven far away from the bumps and it really can't lubricate them, but that's something to think about. Now, a little bit on the lee sides. Until the moats are eroded and intervene, the water wants to go to the low pressure on the lee side, but it can't get there, and except by groundwater. So there's probably a really strong transient. Others have pointed this out before. The sediment flux probably is pulsed or it spreads out into fingers. You have much greater ability to transport sediment than you do sediment supply. The sediment goes to the lee side, you can deposit it there in any cavity that's trying to open. The sediment's coming from a soft place. You're not adding that much by erosion over one bump. So the sediment has to be soft on the downstream side for continuity to get the same sediment transport. And so why are they soft on the crests is the main continuity coming from upstream. Okay. You probably are eroding in those troughs. Okay, so the bed is eroding, and so you probably erosional on the troughs and depositional on the crests. So we can go back here, just a word about, I've got a picture of Joe Walder. Joe did this brilliant work on cavities. How long is a cavity? Well, it's opened by flow and it's closed by creep into the low pressure. We know the water pressure on Thwaites in the lee on the crests. And if you put that water pressure into the Walder relation, the cavity length is the circumference of the Earth. Right? So in this case, the water pressures are too high for the Walder balance to be closing them. That applies to other systems. In this case, they really are close. They run into the next bump. And if they didn't run into the next bump, then it would be the background gradient that controlled them. Okay. So we think that you could have a fairly big cavity back there once the water can get in by groundwater flow, and then it can fill by sediment and so on. Now, let me show you one little bit more about this. Some of the important work has been done by Slavic and Grace Barczyk and company showed down here. Some of the important work has been done by Andy Smith and co-workers on Rutford, and I'm going to show this in the next picture. And the broad picture is what I just told you, soft on the crests, harder in the troughs, as well as on the upstream sides, seems to be much broader beneath West Antarctica. And so if you haven't seen Grace's and Slavic's paper, go look at that. And if you haven't seen this work, I'm sorry, I didn't find a picture of Ed King, and there's some other collaborators, but this is over on Rutford. This is the most heroic thing I've ever seen. They drove all of those radar lines. It is just fantastic, except the ones where they would have fallen in crevasses and died, and they didn't drive those. And they made this map of the bed of the glacier, and there's the ice is flowing against the bump sticking up, and it has these beautiful flutings, and there's the moat, and there's the moat, and there's the moats up here. It's the same thing. And if we look at that, so here's Sophia's work. This is really, really exciting. They put in seismometers to listen to the micro earthquakes over this grid that they had. And there's where the micro earthquakes are. And I'm just going to go to the cartoon. Where is the bed hard enough to be breaking against the bedrock bump and down in the troughs? It's the same picture, and that's what Grace and Slavic got over on the other side too. Right? So we are hoping that we're going to get a lot more of this once COVID allows GHOST to go do serious field work and make sense of this. We need this kind of field work. We need to know what is down there, what it's doing, where it is the drag. There's just this huge challenge to get this right. But I think what we're looking for, the working hypotheses, the things to test, I think the role of pressure deviations from ice flow against topography have been maybe a little underestimated in past work. Ian had me mapping hydrologic potential without including the pressure deviations from ice flow against topography. I was wrong. Those maps are probably wrong. And maybe there's a little tweaking to some other maps. Okay? In this case, the cavity lengths are not controlled by the Walder balance. They're controlled by the next bedrock high or by the background potential. Okay? The bed forms are probably spectacular because the ice is old, not because it's a fancy place. Interesting hypothesis that the heat flow convergence to the abrading class sides may help in making them drag hard to abrade. There's this there's back in the 80s, there's a drumlin bibliography with over 1,000 references, and a lot of them were are drumlins, are bed forms erosional or depositional? And Rich Whitaker and Dave Michelson back in the 70s said, oh, they're both. They were right. They're both. It's erosional and depositional. Okay. The flow stability, the water routing have likely evolved over time. The basal flow law is spatially variable at a fairly fine scale. Viscous on the Stoss faces into the troughs between flutes if we stay below an econ limit. Plastic on the lee side crests and in the major basins, and whether that's important needs to be assessed. The task is huge, but I think we know how to go do it now, and that's hugely wonderful. So do I know the answer? No, of course I don't. Is this, am I just sitting on the edge of my seat hoping for the data that are going to come back? Well, you jolly well better believe I am. So I will leave you with that picture. And then if I'll pop forward and advertise the next talk, and then I'll shut up and we'll see if we can have a chat here. So remember, next week, with the new system that Tavy is putting into place, you definitely want to hear Alex Frazier talking about Antarctic fast ice. So thank you for coming, and I'll shut up and see what we can do.
Well, thank you very much indeed. That was an absolutely fantastic talk. So the way that we usually do questions is we ask people to indicate on the chat that they've got a question to ask. And then we ask people to unmute and ask their question. So we get a feeling of a real community here. So are there any questions for Richard? We've also got an audience going on Facebook. So we may get questions there. Where have my chat gone? I've lost it temporarily.
I see it. Thanks, Seeley. Yeah, nothing has popped in yet that I see. So and I know a few of you were on here. And Doug, if you want to add anything I missed on that, or any of the others who are there, it's obviously very little of this is my work. I just sit or hang around with good people and see what I can learn. So. Rob's been taking pictures of this with the side scan sonar off the coast. It's a huge amount of similarity between what we're seeing beneath the glacier and what is seen offshore as well. And I should have flagged the important work being done offshore because they've got the same thing out there. And hi, Kathy Lick, too. She does this as well. So.
A quick question from me then to start off the discussion, perhaps. I'll go first, Rebecca, and you can go second. I was just interested in how you feel this is going to play forward into ice sheet models for prediction of the key things that we need to predict, sea level rise, obviously being the most important one. You know, how do we include these kind of crinkle cut beds and beds that are so variable spatially into ice sheet models?
Yeah, I'm hoping that Ian Jochen has it right, and that the tells will prove to be so soft that essentially the crests of the bed forms don't matter, and you just need to figure out where the troughs have drag and then parameterize them. And because I think their wavelength is small enough relative to the ice thickness, you'll probably be able to just parameterize that as a smaller drag with more or less the same flow law, with this huge worry about whether they're up to an econ limit or not. And what's going, I mean, so that picture of micro earthquakes, what is that actually telling us? So my guess is that will be the way to get it forward, but I'm not positive.
Thank you. I think, Rebecca, you were probably the first with your hand up there.
Yes, thank you, Richard. That was really interesting. I was wondering, do you have a feeling or do you have a number of how the perturbations scale in the vertical? So kind of talking about bump height versus moat depth.
Yeah. Doug has a pretty, I don't know if Doug would like to answer that. When Doug put in the moats with the depth, he played around with it a little bit, and they're significant. They increase the drag of the bump because it's higher now. But they didn't qualitatively change it. It was quantitatively. So I think that one's one that the good models all can handle at this point. So they may have to worry a little bit about doing something that's higher order or full Stokes because it is a fairly complicated topography, but I think these good models can really do it. I'm not sure, did that answer?
So is the answer that it does not scale as much, like you don't expect the same depth of the moat as the height of the bump? Is that
so Doug and I didn't go that far, and
okay.
I think that's a fascinating question. So at what point would a moat quit eroding, right? So is there a steady state moat or a non-steady state moat? And we didn't get that far. I think it's an absolute fascinating question. I think it's also a fascinating question that those of you remember John Shaw. John was working on these moats. He finds little tiny ones, and he found great big ones. He suspected, and I think most of us suspect, that there are probably lots and lots of moats in deglaciated terrains, and that their preservation potential stinks, because what happens when the glacier melts away, if there's a moat, it fills with a lake, it washes in, you lose the moat really fast to subaerial processes. But John found some moats in some places, and there probably are lots of them. And whether we can learn from deglaciated terrains how they work, I think it's an interesting question.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
So maybe this is a good time to ask Rob, did you want to unmute yourself and just make your comment there? You had to comment on the chat, Rob Latta.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, I mean, I just commenting on what Richard said, that we have lots of great data, and of course with multi-beam sonars on ships you can cover huge areas very quickly and at quite high resolution, which is fantastic. But that's fantastic, but what's tougher is we then have to reconstruct the glacial context. So it's seeing the data like Ed King collected on the Rutford was just great, because we always had reviewers saying, well, you don't really know that these things were formed beneath ice streams, do you? And you know, that proved the point. So yeah, it swings and roundabouts. But can I ask a question now I'm here? Because Rebecca, who just spoke, gave a great seminar at Bass recently on a sort of very similar theme on new data from the Rutford. So in the Rutford, and even more in Thwaites, we're in a state where the bed is at the pressure melting point. Am I correct? Yeah.
Yes.
So there's water forming at the bed all the time. And if you've got this high pressure on the upstream end of your bed, your bump, isn't there even more water forming there? And what happens to that water that's formed in situ?
Right. So we would guess that it follows that internal closed loop and runs around to the other side. Eventually, you could accumulate a lot of it and make a water-filled cavity, and then you subsequently could fill that cavity with sediment being transported over the top. But it's a pretty, you know, anything you do on one bump is small compared to everything that's done on all the stuff upstream. And so the main flow is probably almost always that which is going around rather than that which is generated locally. And eventually you have to integrate those flows. But so the presumption when you melt it on the upstream side, it flows to the downstream side. It makes a little water-filled cavity that can then fill up with sediment. And thank you. And as I said, the work they're doing is just spectacular. And Rebecca's work is spectacular too. It's really wonderful. we get spoiled rotten by these people that go out in the field and do heroics and build the instruments and make the data and bring them home. And it's, you know, just a huge hat tip.
Kathy Lift, you were early with your hand there. So do you want to go next?
Hi, Richard. As always, that was an awesome talk. Good to see you and very thought-provoking. And I was wondering, how might sediment fabric data from till be useful in informing models of basal conditions?
Yeah, so I sort of glossed over the idea that you're taking the till over the top and dumping it in the lee. Are we really? Have they eroded all the way down, or are they depositional? Is the till back there entirely sort of a flow feature, or does it have prograding bed forms in the back? I'd like to know that. Beyond that, I'd have to think, but I hope you know I always enjoy getting an email from you, and maybe at some point we could get back in touch and chat a little bit and see if there's other ways forward on that. I don't have immediately a glib thing other than thinking about differences between troughs and crests, differences between lee side and stoss sides, and actually testing these hypotheses by getting real on the ground data.
Thanks so much.
Thank you. Sorry. Should we move to Seeley? Do you want to go next? You've got a sort of mix on the pattern.
I'm Julie, Seeley's spouse. Hi. Richard, this was a fascinating talk. Early on, you mentioned the contrast of the soft flow, the hard flow, with a comparison that it seems to be backwards from ground flow. So my question was, as a landlubber, could you elaborate how to think differently of the groundwater and the ice flow?
Sure, thank you, Julie and Seeley. It's great to see you. If suppose for a moment there's no ice on top and we just have a bed, and we have what is the bed, but that's now subaerial, and you've got a hill, you're drumlin, and you've got a trough in between, what does the water do? It drains out of the hill and into the trough. So if you go to Dave Michelson and Rich Whitaker's drumlins, the top of the drumlin is sort of dry, and there's a swamp full of sandhill cranes down between the drumlins in the low spot. And what I'm telling you is that based on the seismics, there's more water in the dirt on the crest of this leaf form bed form under Thwaites than there is down in the trough. So it's just backwards on what you'd see, and it's the effect of the flow is ultimately what's doing it. The flow over the bump opens a lower pressure in the lee side, which is essentially sucking water up into it.
Thank you. And, yes, and stoss is the opposite of lee. That's a new term.
That's correct. So stoss is what you're running against, and lee is what you're pulling away from. So yes, sorry.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Great work. Lovely to be in your community presence.
Let's move to Roger Clark.
Yeah, thanks very much, Davey, and thank you, Richard, for the talk. Question about these bed layers you're talking about. One way to put it, how thick do they need to be to behave in the way that you're describing, or equivalently, how thin can they get when it doesn't start to matter that they're there? And
Right.
I ask in the context of both radar and seismic reflectivity. You know, we can do great stuff treating it as an isolated half space, but it gets a bit worrisome when you start to include thin layer effects that can divert you from what's really there.
Yeah, no, I mean, I glossed a little, and thank you to call us back. You know, the Sridhar's work, the seismic works, if it's less than half a wavelength, you can't really tell what's there. It's a thin layer effect. Canute has done a lot of effort trying to do thin layer modeling, but basically you could have a till that is doing a good bit of lubricating that is sub-resolution. What I'm doing a little bit of waving my arms and not being rigorous, and you got me. I'm also doing a fair amount of thinking about what we see on deglaciated terrains. And we actually do know from a whole lot of deglaciated terrains that, and I may fail, but if I can, I'm going to find a couple pictures. You probably know what they look like. But that this picture of thick tills and bedrock sticking out in places actually is a pretty good description of what you find on deglaciated terrains, and thus that it's probably okay to make that assumption that where you see hard doesn't have a really good soft layer in it. And I'm sorry, I failed to find the pictures I wanted to show you, but at any rate, you go pretty much anywhere that a glacier is melting back and you'll see bedrock sticking out facing you and then a telltale on it. And so I think it is fair to take what is seismically resolved and assume that that applies at the scale that you can't resolve. But it's an age-old problem, and it's a problem, a lot of people do roughness with seismics or radar especially. And essentially for roughness, everything that the glacier really cares about for tangential drag is sub-resolution, It's a true frustration of this field.
Absolutely. Well, thanks once
again.
Yeah,
so thin layer and pushing this, right? So, and I know I can tell you the ghost people are thinking seriously about this. They will not solve the problem, but they will try. Is pushing to test this with better resolution, either through higher frequency or through thin layer effects. You still can't. 10 centimeters would probably matter, and you're never going to get to that with a seismic wave,
Not starting at the top anyway.
Not starting at the top, which in turn, right? So Davey is a hero of borehole work. Borehole work is never going to replace surface work, but we got to keep a little of it for very good reasons.
Smashing. Thanks very much. I wish I'd heard that talk before I contributed my 3 penneth to co-supervising Rebecca. Great stuff. Thank you.
Let's move to Weijie Zhang. You've been waiting very patiently.
Well, thanks, Tabby. Hi, Richard. Weijie is here. Well, thank you for your awesome talk. So I guess my question is pretty similar to what we had before, but I'm still really interested in this. So I'm kind of interested in the stability of those bumps. So because we see the moat is actually forming in one side of the bumps. So do they, for example, do the bumps get eroded over time, or do they actually migrate to the leeward?
Yeah, if I suspect that they migrate, I suspect the migration is slow. I think Thwaites, for interesting reasons, hasn't succeeded in really moving its topography. The topography still looks like it's lined up along faults, and I'll be careful about speaking out of turn because Atsu's still working on this, but there probably are faults there. And if the stuff is lined up on them, then it hasn't migrated too far, which means Thwaites hasn't too much beaten up its bed. I'm quite confident that the bed of Jakobshavn, anything is migrated a darn long ways. So my suspicion is that there's a full range from it's migrated a long ways and eventually been erased to it hasn't been modified too much. And Thwaites doesn't seem to have been modified too much. And I'm presuming that's because it, at least in the Pliocene, it was pretty unstable. It'd go away and come back. And every time it went away, it gets a new dump of sediment on top. And so it's living its life trying to get rid of resupplied drapes. So that's a lot of arm waving, but that Thwaites, it has been there for a while, but it has to deal with till and whenever it deglaciated, at least in the Pliocene, probably into the Pleistocene, it's all submarine, so you're probably going to get a new layer that it's got to get rid of.
Okay, so the faults actually make these things a little more complicated.
I think they do. I think they do.
Thanks.
And I think we have a second question from Rebecca.
Yes, I have tons of questions actually, Richard. I think we should get together at some point and
Please.
discuss. But what is your feeling on timescale? Like, how long does it take to erode or, well, partly erode, kind of lengthen the landform?
Yeah, so my guess is that the time scale for lengthening the landform, the deforming beds in soft places are sort of 10 centimeters times the ice velocity. So you can do if the bed is 10 centimeters thick and it's moving with the ice velocity or half the ice velocity, then just take the bump height and you can do it. And so for a little bump, you can build in years. For a big bump, it's 10,000 years or something. But so that would be the time scale. For the erosion, probably millimeters per year to millimeters per 1,000 years, depending on the bed type and how many rocks are in it. And then the moat's 50 meters deep. So, if you're doing it at a millimeter per year, you get a meter in 1,000 and you get 50 meters in 50,000. And so that's not too difficult to get to, which would then go back to the earlier question and say, yeah, they're probably migrating.
Okay.
But I'd love to get together sometime and chat, please.
Yes, definitely. We should do that. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to draw the discussion to a conclusion there simply because we're over our hour and it's late in Europe, and I know that people in the US have other meetings and classes to go to. So thank you very much to everyone for coming. Hope to see you all next week at Alex Fraser's seminar. We're about to move into a bit of a Southern Hemisphere theme. The time zones are better at the moment for the Australians, the Japanese, and South Americans. So we're going to have a bit of a theme of moving to the Southern Hemisphere for a few weeks. Watch out, please, on Cryolist and Facebook, because we're going to move to a new link next week. So watch out. You will all need to re-register again, I'm afraid, but hopefully then we'll be on an IGS link and we'll be a stable place. So thanks very much to Richard. Thanks very much to everyone for coming, and hope to see you all next week. So thank you very much indeed.